All right, in this video, I'm going to go over some of the retrieves in a more visual version that I do for pyramid for the cutthroats with our jigs. This works with a lot of different kind of jigs. This is just how we do it with ours, and the results that we get seem to be pretty good. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This lake has no cutthroat in it, so I don't think I'll be hooking into any of those today. I just wanted to be able to give you guys a little visual. So I have a few there's several retrieves I use for anything we're fishing for, but there's usually like top 2 or 3 that I'll go to with. So the first one is really slow, stripping your jig on the floor, kind of like stripping a streamer, fly fishing style. And that seems to be my best method at pyramid, but it also depends on the bite. If they're feeding or if they're not feeding, and you have to get more of a reaction bite. But this one is if they're feeding, and it's just kind of slow on the floor. And there's a couple different speeds I use, but standard retrieve for me at pyramid is going to be something like this. So I'm going to cast out, let my jig fall all the way to the floor, and usually I'll kind of, depending on the depth, I'll leave the bail open about halfway down and then click it, and because it gives it a little slower fall, and sometimes they'll pick that thing up on the drop. But let it hit the floor, kind of wind up all the slack on your line, and then I'm just going to pull back and wind forward. Pull back, wind forward. And this will vary. Sometimes I'll only pull back a foot, real short pulls, and sometimes I do them a little longer. Sometimes I do them a little longer, more like 2 feet up to 3 feet pulls, long strides on the floor. But typically it's anywhere from 1 to 2 feet. So what that jig is going to do is it'll be on the bottom. It'll pull up anywhere from 6 to 12 inches, depending on the speed you pull, go up and come back down. So it's just making these long striding hops across the floor. So one more time on that one. Click the bail, let it fall all the way back down to the floor. Wind up the slack. I'm going to pull back, wind forward, pull back, wind forward. And it may seem repetitive, but it's not always every cast that you get a fish there. This must be a stump out there or something. I have to cast the other way. I know it's safe over there. All right. So it's not every cast you're going to get a fish at this place. Sometimes the bite is on, sometimes it's really tough. So I kind of stick with the same thing, fan casting, work my whole area in front of me. And I'll just kind of stick with the same retrieve and the same color for a little while. If I notice that others are hooking up and they're using something totally different, then obviously I'll switch. But, if it's slow for everyone, I'm going to stick to what I'm doing because I have faith that retrieve and that color are going to work at some point when they come through. So it's again, pull, wind the slack. And I'm not trying to reel the jig towards me while I'm reeling forward. That's just winding up the slack. The jig comes forward to you when you pull. Wind forward, pull back, wind forward, pull back. And this last trip we were on out at Pyramid, I was getting them doing that retrieve, but it was kind of weird. So it was hit the floor, and my reel's a little bigger that I use for there, so the cadence is a little different, but it was kind of like this. It was more sudden pulls. So quick pulls, short quick pulls, maybe a foot, wind down, maybe a foot, pull back, and then wind back forward. And that seemed to be the better, like I pulled long and slow a lot of times and got nothing. And as soon as I started switching it up to these shorter, more erratic pulls, so these are real quick little strips hopping on the floor, that's what got them going. Now that retrieve doesn't work all the time. That retrieve worked for me like the second or third day. The first day, everyone was kind of using the same exact retrieve, and it was, we're always going down to the floor. So it was either like this to the side, with quick little pops, quick fast little jig pops like this to the side, and keeping it pretty steady the whole way in. or my buddy Cam, who was with us, and this is a pretty standard jig retrieve for that lake. Keeping it kind of 6 inches above the off the floor, keeping it winding, and every now and then giving it a couple little sudden pops. So you're kind of a little bit of a jig retrieve with a medium, slow to medium reel. Every now and then give it a couple little erratic pops, like pop, pop, as Jesse would say. Pop, pop. And a lot of times they'll be following your jig and maybe a little interested, but not really interested enough to commit. And it jerks a couple times off the floor and they chase that thing down, or they eat it when it comes back down to the floor usually. So again, on that one, let it go all the way to the bottom. Nice slow to medium reel with a little bit of a jig in it. Every now and then give it a couple little hard little pops. I don't do them super high. Some guys do. I do them, just enough to lift it up off the floor, maybe 1 to 2 feet, and then let it fall back down, but never really letting it fall all the way to the floor. If it hits the bottom, no big deal, but you're not wanting to sit and then start going. You want to keep it going, up off the floor, keep it moving the whole time. And another one that works pretty good, my Pops does this one a lot, and all of them are on the bottom. I've fished the top column, I've fished the middle column and got a couple, but most of the action is on the floor. So let your jig go all the way to the bottom, and this one is just real slow and subtle. So very slow retrieve with a really, really slow wind. And what this is doing is your jig is just barely bouncing off the floor, just barely kicking up sand more likely, and just kind of bringing attention to itself, but at the same time not being too aggressive, where if the fish are not wanting something that's too much, this is a real easy meal for them to pick up. They might think it's a leech or a wounded bait fish down on the floor. So real slow, real steady little bounce, and this is pretty much making contact the whole time on the floor. And all three of those retrieves, you can vary the speed. So you can do that one that's steady and maybe speed it up a little bit so it's staying a few inches off the bottom and it's not hugging the floor. But each one of those retrieves, you can just, you can pull back fast, wind down, pull back fast, wind down, until you find something that works. And sometimes you'll have to go through 2 or 3 retrieves, changing the speed of each one of those 2 or 3 times until you find something that's, that's they're wanting to eat. But some days that lake is so on fire that you could throw it out and just start reeling it in and doing nothing, and they'll just inhale it. But some days you really got to work for it, and you got to find the color and the size that's working. And I fish light stuff out there, but some guys are fishing heavier line and they have to throw the heavier jig, so your retrieve is your bounces are gonna be more aggressive. Where a light little pop on mine, if I was throwing a 3/8 ounce jig, that's barely gonna come off the floor. So then I'd have to really work to get that thing up. So hopefully by watching this, you can kind of see how I'm using the rod and get an idea of how I use it out there, how our whole group is using these jigs out at that lake to have the results that we have. But just stick to there's a bunch of little bluegill out there chasing this thing in. Stick to the retrieves. These are what work for us, and we've caught plenty of big fish out there and had plenty of high number days. So, like I said, the most common one that I use is the stripping method, pulling the bait along the floor. And usually, sometimes like when you're pulling back, they'll slam it, but a lot of times it's on the wind back down. When you're winding back down, retrieving the slack, that's when you'll go to pull again and it's just already loaded up. So just beware. It'll feel like you're stuck on a tree stump. You'll go pull back, and then all of a sudden your rod will start loading forward and you're on. That's about it for this video. I'm just taking a few more casts. There's some little bass swimming around in here, seeing if I can get any of them to go. A little bit of weeds. These things are great if bass are feeding off the floor. It doesn't have to be spawn season. I see some bass like rolling out here, and I'm guessing it's on these schools of bluegill, but I see them rolling out here. And if they're feeding off the floor and you get this thing a nice little bounce on the bottom, they'll pick it up pretty quick, I've found. a little bass like that big.